Joining us today is Sandra Tamari, who from Adalah Justice Project. Sandra is a Palestinian-American organizer and the acting director of the Adalah Justice Project. Prior to her work at AJP, Sandra served as the senior program manager for Ahmadiyist, the assistant director of Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and from 2008 to 2009 worked for the Jannah Arab Resource Center for Popular Arts in Beirut. She is the co-founder of the St. Louis Palestine Solidarity Committee and was co-chair of the steering committee for the U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights from 2015 to 2018. Since the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson in August 2014, she has focused her work on building joint liberation efforts between Palestinians and Black Americans. The Adalah Justice Project transforms public discourse and U.S. policy on Palestine-Israel through public education, coalition building, and advocacy for universal rights-based policies. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sandra to you guys.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. This is my first time speaking in New Jersey and my first time at PACC, so thank you so much. I've known Diab and Bassem for a little while, and I've been hearing about the center, but it's beyond my expectations. And I wish, growing up as a Palestinian American, that my community in Jacksonville had something like this. We had spaces where you could gather for culture, spaces that you could gather to learn, about our heritage, but we'd never had these kinds of really in-depth political conversations and to learn how do we advocate for our people and for ourselves. And so this is a dream, and thank you to everyone who's making this possible. As Ahmed said, I am running an organization called the Adalah Justice Project. Adalah was founded in 2017. It's a fairly new advocacy organization, but we have a long history of being connected with Adalah, the legal center for Arab minority rights based in Haifa. That's a long name for an organization that's been doing work for over 20 years inside the Israeli legal system. So representing Palestinian citizens of Israel initially, really focusing on strategic litigation inside the courts to try to get basic rights, to have people be able to stay in their homes, to be able to stay on their land inside. We're talking about 1948. And now really talking about a legal regime that impacts not only Palestinian citizens of Israel, but all of us, even those in this room. And so I want to make a case that we have a key, we have an important role to play. If we want to change the way that we think about Palestine, we have to speak the truth, right? So I want to open this conversation with recognizing the land that we stand on. Here in New Jersey, in New York, in the areas around us, we stand on Lenape Land, and that we need to make that acknowledgement because this is the same issue that we are fighting for. That we're fighting a settler colonial regime, and the Lenape, the signs of the Lenape are everywhere around us, right? The words, Manhattan is a Lenape word. It means hilly place, right? This is important for us to remember that even though many of us are here as refugees, many of us are here as immigrants, we still contribute to settler colonialism, right? And so a lot of the way that Adalah tries to approach the work in the US is to make connections, right? That we are building coalitions that are not only fighting for the rights of Palestinians. Palestinians, of course, deserve their rights. They're deserving of their dignity, they're deserving of equality. But we're not the only people that are suffering in the world, right? And that here in the U.S., we make a case for Palestine by connecting with their oppression, with other people's oppression. So, I do live in St. Louis, and so Mike Brown's assassination happened miles from my home, and it was impossible in that summer of 2014 not to make those connections. We all know what was happening in Gaza in 2014, what was happening in Jerusalem. And to see the way that as Mike Brown was lying on the ground for those 4.5 hours, and his mother unable to get to him, how he was being dehumanized. Before we even knew his name, people on social media were saying, well, he attacked the police officer. He was obviously violent. He was a big man, so he posed a threat. Or he was a thug, or a thief. And these were the justifications used for his murder. And we know how that dehumanization works against our community, and how Israel twists the facts and creates animals out of people that we love and that we know have grace and dignity and humanity that they will never understand, right? So I think it's really important for us to ground us in that we're part of a larger movement for justice, okay? But I really want to turn our focus on 48, because I think this heritage project is amazing. And I wish you had more time to spend in 48, and I wish all of us had more time to learn about 48. So I hope I'll give you a little bit of a glimpse of what's happening to Palestinians who remain in the homeland in 48. We'll start with a question, because I want to get you all, excited. How many issues of the Palestinian cause do you think you can explain through 1948? And you can just yell out your answers. Yeah? Yeah, exactly. You guys are, you're way ahead of the curve. This is a smart crowd. Okay. Yeah, so we're going to talk about all of them, right? I really think that in addition to being able to explain, I think that we're able to dismantle the mythology around Zionism most effectively through 1948. And so let's dive in a little bit and think about that. The case I want to make is that the treatment of Palestinian citizens of Israel is a microcosm of the way that Israel oppresses the Palestinian people writ large. And so we have an opportunity to use this case to be better at advocating. So let's start for those maybe who are not less familiar. Who are the Palestinians of 1948? We call them a homeland minority. A lot of people ask me, why does Adalah use this idea of Arab minority, right? This is a legal term that comes from the UN. And they use Arab in this case because we also represent the occupied people of the Golan. So something to think about. We are in conversation now with our partners in Haifa about changing the name and becoming more of a human rights organization, maybe representing even African refugees, like talking about human rights in Israel writ large. But that is the reason that we use minority in our name. 1.5 million people, 20% of the population, of the citizenry. So 1 in 5 Israelis are Palestinian. So this causes a lot of, this is a disruptor, right, when you talk about the Jewish state. And then they're caught, right? They're caught between their identity and the disconnection they have from other Arabs and from Palestinians in other places. So, because they speak Hebrew, some people, don't really understand who they are, what are they doing. I used to be that way, to be very honest. Like, why are these people speaking Hebrew? I don't get it. I don't understand why but this is their reality, right? They're trying to survive in a very hostile environment. So I want to, spend some time talking about 4 issues that overlap, obviously. But I think this is what helps us dispel a lot of the Zionist myths, right? So if we talk about return, we're talking about right of return versus Israel's law of return. So we can think about that. We can talk about this idea that Israel is the only democracy in the region and how they use the idea that Palestinians can vote in elections and serve in the Knesset to maintain their, facade. We can talk about equality and how that's such a threat to the state. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about citizenship. Okay? So let's dive in. Return, right? Why are we a minority in our homeland? We're a minority because of the Nakba, and because most of Palestinians were forced out, right? So, and they're forced out and denied the right to return. We know this. But Israel defines itself as a Jewish state, not a state of its citizens, a state of the Jewish people all over the world, right? So any Jewish person from anywhere can present themselves and become a citizen of the state. This is, a demographic, artificial demographic that maintains their hegemony over the place. So this is one of the mythologies that exist, obviously. And it also helps us to think about, what does it mean to demand right of return, right? So when Gaza was rising up this past year, not demanding what they need immediately, which is electricity, access to enough food, freedom to move without war raining down on them. They didn't choose to, base their struggle on any of those things. They said it was about return. And this is very powerful. And the fact that they started their march on March 30th, which is Land Day, which is a day about 48, about land confiscation in 48, I think is also really important for us to think about the connections between people, that our borders these borders are artificial. And so I think it's really, that the return becomes the core. So 48 is the core. Last summer, the Knesset passed the Jewish nation-state law. You've all heard of it, right? The nation-state law is the equivalent to the we the people of the United States, right? It defines who the state is for, who it's about, who's included in the polity. And this is a we the people that says we, the state of Israel, is for the Jewish people only. Self-determination is only for the Jewish people. And for those of you who read it closely, you also saw that they didn't define the borders of the state that the Jewish people have, right? They used two terms in the opening of the nation-state law. They used state of Israel and nation of Israel. And they never said what the borders of that state are. It's very clear when you read the rest of the law that they're talking about all of historic Palestine. So Jewish self-determination is exclusively for the Jewish people. Self-determination is exclusive to the Jewish people in all of historic Palestine. So they've made what we've known for some time very clear, and they've made it law. Israel doesn't have a constitution. It has a series of basic laws. And so this is like the opening. This is the preamble of their future constitution. So they made it very clear to us. Let's think about the myth of democracy, right? We hear this struggle between Jewish and democratic, right? How can you be both? How can you be a state that defines yourself as for one people and also be a democracy? This is a myth. There's a very, I think it's a very helpful kind of thinking. There's a philosopher that once said, ignorance is not the absence of knowledge. Ignorance is the presence of myth. I'll say it one more time. That ignorance is not the absence of knowledge, but rather the presence of myth. So these mythologies are what we're dealing with. This idea that Israel can be all of these things, and people believe it. I think people in this country really believe it. I think Zionists believe these things. So you can't be Jewish and democratic at the same time. A Pew Forum in 2016 showed that more than half of Israelis think that Palestinians should be expelled from the country. Citizens. So this is what we're dealing with. This is the kind of hatred we're dealing with. Stemming from democracy, we also have this myth that somehow voting rights and serving in the Knesset make for a democracy. I don't think that we're living up to Naomi Klein's assertion that democracy means the ability to live in dignity. voting is not the answer, right, for people. Voting would mean that you have a say in your future. If you have a state that's defining its constitution as not being for you, then voting doesn't really mean much, right? We have 13 members of Knesset that are Palestinian at this point out of 120. But important to note that there's a law in the books now, the expulsion law, that makes it possible for the Knesset to vote out any member for any reason, right? So it just takes, a vote of 90 members of Knesset to kick out someone. So we don't have numbers on our side. If they want Palestinians out of Knesset, they're out. That's the reality of it. And that Arab party has ever been invited into a ruling coalition, right? So we know that they don't have power. Right now, the elections are happening. April 9th is when the Israeli elections are scheduled. And this is my first year at Adalah during an election season. And the normalized kind of racism that's coming out of the Israel campaigns has really been shocking to me. I mean, I know it exists. We've heard in the past the Minister of Justice saying that we should shoot, pregnant Palestinian women. She put out an ad, Adalah Shaked, a few days ago, and she really thought this was a good idea. This is what shocks me. She put out an ad showing herself in a perfume ad and spraying herself with perfume called fascism. And it's just, it smells like democracy to me, is what she said. And so the thing she's talking about, that she's getting, she's trying to be ironic, obviously. She's trying to say that, the things that we're doing, like trying to take power back from the Supreme Court and shrink the space for activism, that's just democracy. That's how we do it, Anyway, it's more reality TV in some ways, right? We have this issue now with, we've done a really good job of putting Netanyahu and Trump into the same basket, which I think has been very effective, right? People are really pulling away, and we see what's happening with PACC, presidential candidates saying, no way, I'm not going to appear in the same forum with Netanyahu. Great. So who's the alternative? We have Benny Gantz running for the top seat. And his first ad in his campaign was bragging about how many people he killed in Gaza. This is how you gain, legitimacy, right? So we don't have much of an alternative in this election. Equality. Okay. Equality seems like a nice word, right? Seems like a pretty basic requirement of most states. I mean, here we like to think that we have equality. We have equality in most laws. Implementation is another story, obviously. But in Israel, it's not even enshrined in the law. There's no place in Israeli law where equality is enshrined. Last year, just before the nation-state law was introduced, Arab members of Knesset knew it was coming. So members of the Balad party introduced legislation called State of All Its Citizens, which was a basic law that defines Israel as a place of equality for all of its citizenry, regardless of ethnic background, religion, all the things that we would hope a state would uphold. This law never made it to a vote. It was struck down by the leadership of the Knesset and not allowed to go to the floor for a full vote because it threatened the Jewish nature of the state. So this is one example of how equality is a threat, right? Adalah has developed a database of discriminatory laws, which you can find at adalah.org. We've documented over 65 discriminatory laws. I mean, really, once you pass the nation-state law, these other laws are just, footnotes. But you can take a look at the way that funding, that housing, that every aspect of a Palestinian's life inside 48 is impacted by the law. So there's no room for equality. Okay, let's turn to democracy. Oh, I'm sorry. I think I skipped one thing. I want to say, too, about the state of all its citizens. The elections committee, which is in the Knesset, decides who can run in the elections. Each year, each time there's an election, they decide if the party meets minimum requirements. There is a law that says that if you threaten the Jewish nature of the state, that you're not allowed to run. So there was a complaint fired against Beled. Why? Because they introduced the state of all its citizens. Because they had introduced this legislation. And so Adalah had to go to court to try to overturn that decision by the elections committee. And in the end, Beled is going to be allowed to run in the election, but it just shows you it goes back to this idea that they tried to introduce the equality clause in the law. The dangerous part about these disqualifications in the elections is that they try to put us on equal footing. Because they also, you've heard that the Kahanists are back, and Netanyahu is going to be forming a coalition with these extremists. And so one of the Arab parties filed a complaint against the head of the Kahanists. And so now you see this way that people are making equivalencies between Beled, the leftists that are calling for equality, and these violent extremists, right? It's very similar to, I think it has an analogy here in the US, the way they're talking about anti-Semitism. And the way they're saying there's anti-Semitism from the right, which we know is extremist, violent, dangerous, and anti-Semitism on the left, which really is just about a freedom struggle, about equality. It's not anti-Semitism, but it's a way of silencing advocacy for Palestine. So this is a really good tactic that they're using to equate extremes, that they're saying that they're equivalent. I think that that's important for us to think about as we're thinking about our advocacy. Okay, are there any citizens of Israel in the room? No. Okay, so if we had somebody, I'd ask them to show us their ID. So if you have, if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you're a citizen of the state, but your nationality is different, right? Your nationality is not Israeli. There's no such thing as an Israeli nationality. Your nationality is defined in one of several categories. I think there are over 20. But the main ones being you're a Jewish national, an Arab national, a Druze national, right? So your citizenship doesn't mean full rights. Full rights only belong to those who are of the Jewish nation, okay? So this was put into law, and it's very meaningful for Israel to be able to determine who's suitable, who's not suitable. There's admissions committees for many housing developments inside of 48. And a committee of Jews decides if you're socially suitable to live in that community. And they know, based on your ID card, where you actually are from, who you are. And so they can make all kinds of claims against people, trumped up. They don't say, we're not allowing you to live here because you're an Arab or because you're a Palestinian. They'll say, well, you know, we have certain religious requirements in our community, or we have certain cultural requirements in our community, and so that they can reject a Palestinian from living there in that community. So this is segregation that's not, it's not overt racism. I mean, it's obviously racism, but they're being very careful in the way that they implement the racism. So Jim Crow comes to mind. And then we have, I think this is one of the main things that we're thinking about, the way defining citizenship. The Citizenship and Entry into Israel law, which was passed in 2003, is the law that determines who a Palestinian of 48 can marry and live with in the state. So if a Palestinian citizen of Israel marries somebody from the West Bank, it's virtually impossible for that person to live with their spouse inside of 48. this is not only is Palestinian, if any Palestinian of, of descent from anywhere outside of 48 has a problem with coming in as a spouse. If you're from Lebanon, Iran, Syria, you're also banned. So this is putting limits on who you can fall in love with, right? This is love under apartheid. Important to remember that citizenship usually means that you can bring whoever you marry into the country. So this is important. Family reunification. There are many families impacted by this law. So hundreds of families who are still seeking recourse in the courts to try to be able to live with their spouses and with their children. And then I'd like to focus a little bit on the Bedouin of the Nakab. In addition to our office in Haifa, Adalah has an office in the Nakab, and they've been working with the Bedou. These are people that live in unrecognized villages, so they were forced off their land and then put into certain spaces of land by the state, but those towns are unrecognized, meaning they're not on maps. They don't receive infrastructure. They don't have water. They don't have electricity. It's very similar to the way that, part of our work for the Adalah Justice Project is we want to make connections. And we went to Louisiana, where they're building the Dakota Access Pipeline, the tail end of it, through the Louisiana Bayou. And maybe some of you have heard of Cancer Alley. Maybe some of you have heard of, the resistance to the pipeline. The way that pipeline was mapped by the companies was through unincorporated territories, unincorporated towns, so that when the big oil companies were looking at the route of the map, they didn't have any impediments because those black communities and those indigenous communities weren't on the maps. They know they're there, but they were able to draw, and then the state and federal government said, sure, go right on ahead, go through. This is very similar to what happens to the Bedou. They use this as an opportunity. Right now, the latest issue is that they've announced a new development plan. Israel, 36,000 people are going to be displaced by this plan. Adalah, for over 10 years, worked with the village of El-Haran. Has anyone heard of El-Haran? So El-Haran is just on the 48 side, just over the Green Line, right? And the closest West Bank village is Susa. So Susa got a lot of attention, right? You saw a lot of liberal Zionist groups that were talking about how terrible what's happening in Susa is. J Street was all about it because it undermines the two-state solution, right? 3 miles away, El-Haran is happening. El-Haran has received eviction orders. Most of the people have left now. What Israel plans to do with these Palestinian citizens of Israel, because they're citizens, is move them into a planned community and build, with JNF funds, JNF USA, Jewish National Fund, USA funds, another town for Jews only, and it's in their charter, Jews only, named Haran. I mean, it's just, it's like they don't even pretend, right? But the connections, I think, are really important because the Green Line does not exist, right? It's really important for us to recognize that Israel is operating one legal regime in all of historic Palestine. They've told us, they passed the law, they passed the constitutional law that says it's one regime with no borders. This is for us, all of it. So I think it's really crucial for us to understand it. Because when we fragment our advocacy, when we fragment our people, we say, oh, the issues of Gaza are one thing, the issues of Al-Quds are something else, the issues in the West Bank are occupation. The reality is the occupation was exported from 48, from 1966. From 1948 to 1966, Palestinian citizens of Israel were under martial law. They were, monitored. They had checkpoints. They had curfews. They had military occupation of their towns. And when Israel occupied the West Bank in 1967, they simply replicated those systems and put them in place, right? So we're talking about one regime, different levels of severity, different tactics, but one key, the key being as much land as possible with as few Palestinians. So that's my conclusion. I really hope that we can think together, like I want to leave enough space for our conversation. We can think together about how to break down some of this fragmentation. Because what's happening in Gaza today, the isolation of our people, the breakdown within the society, the violence that's happening within our own societies, this is planned, right? And then until we combat that, we're not going to be effective. We have to really think, that's why I'm really excited to be in this space. Like, I never had a space that invited all Palestinians, right? It would be a space, for a village or for a town. I'm from Ramallah, so very closed off from other people. Not all of us, not all of us. But I think, as a West Banker myself, like learning about 48 has been very powerful in thinking about my advocacy, because it helps us break down those myths, because the myths are the problem. We can talk and talk and give facts all the time, but we're not going to break down the ignorance until we break down the mythologies that exist. So I'm going to end by putting up some information about Adalah. My colleague Izzadeen Mustafa is here. He's our social media guru. He's got us all set up, so please follow us. Keep in touch with me. I'd be very happy to hear from you. And then if you'd like to go to our website, we have lots of information, and you can sign up for our weekly newsletter. And I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you.